greater economic freedom is quite strongly associated with a smaller fertility gap. The whole zoning code, press delete, that's the best housing policy. Losing 25% of your population each generation, that's not a little thing you fix with a few immigrants here or there. Immigrants on average tend to have higher likelihood of patenting and entrepreneurship than natives in most countries.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman. Today we'll be discussing the economics of fertility. Why are people across the world having fewer children? And what, if anything, can or should be done about it? To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Lyman Stone, who is a demographer and senior fellow at the Institute of Family Studies. So, Lyman, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So, I suppose the first question is, what is happening to birth rates in the developed world, and why should we care?
So, birth rates are going down throughout most of the developed world, and in fact, the developing world, I should mention. India is below replacement rate fertility today. So they're going down, and they're going down rather quickly. It's one thing if birth rates kind of gradually drift down over many decades, but over the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a really startling pace of decline. And among countries that were already not super high fertility. Korea, right, has one of the biggest absolute declines in fertility is in Korea. And they were already only at 1.2 when the current decline started. So now they're 0.7
children per woman.
Sorry, yes, 1.2
Yeah.
children, projected children per woman. So when we talk about children per woman, what we're doing is we're taking the age-specific probabilities of birth and then summing them. So this is a very naive way of forecasting completed fertility of a woman who's 15 years old today.
Yeah.
I guess I should say a girl who's 15 years old today. So that's what's happening. There are a lot of different factors that feed into why. The deep underlying factors are basically skills-biased technical change. So skills-biased technical change basically means that the economy increasingly demands and rewards skills that take time to acquire.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, there aren't as many, the jobs that you can just walk on and do on day one don't pay relatively as well as they did in the past. Okay. Skills-biased technical change, and then skills-biased technical change both feeds into and is abetted by a cultural change towards later and less marriage. Okay? Those two forces, later and less marriage and skills-biased technical change, and they are related. Skills-biased technical change definitely feeds into later marriage as people kind of reach economic maturity later. But also there's a cultural shift towards delayed and less marriage. These two forces are suppressing fertility around the world. So then neither of these are brand new forces in the last 20 years. So people often ask, so why did things change in the last 10 or 20 years? And there's a couple reasons. One, fertility is not randomly distributed with age. Right?
Yeah.
People are just way more likely to have a baby at some ages than others. There are not many 85-year-olds having babies. There are not many 8-year-olds having babies. Most people having babies tend to be in their 20s and 30s and stuff like that. Furthermore, babies are sequential. You can't have a third baby without having a first baby. It's just, they come in order.
Yeah.
So the result is, if you don't get started by a certain point, your odds of having more or having any given number fall non-linearly. Okay? So let's say you want to have 2 kids. Okay? Let's say that's your goal. It doesn't really matter if you have your first kid at age 17, 20, 22, or 27. You have plenty of time to have a second kid. Right? At any of those births, at any of those ages of a first birth, you really have plenty of time to have number 2. But if you have your first birth at age 35, it's much harder to get that second. Likewise, if you want 3 kids, the more kids you want, the earlier you have to start. And as the age at marriage rises,
Right.
you start to get these places where the share of people who just don't have time for a third or a second or a first just rises. You hit certain ages and it's just,
Yeah.
right? And so what's happened around the world is over the last 10, 20 years, ages at marriage and ages at first cohabitation and ages at first birth have started to hit these ages where there's just no time.
Mm.
The other thing that is going on the last 10 or 20 years that's harder to get a handle on is gendered polarization of values and attitudes driven by basically the decline of in-person socializing and the rise of online socializing. This is connected to like changing burden of mental health conditions, polarization of genders on political views, differential educational performance. Like all these things are kind of linked together. And I think the fundamental force underlying all of them is we just don't spend time together in person anymore.
Mm.
Right.
And
If
that
you can see this
means you're
unused data.
less likely to get, and so this means you're less likely to get married. And is the still
Also, but not just married, you're just less likely to learn to enjoy the other sex.
right?
Like, men are an acquired taste.
Uh-huh.
And like when men just hang out with men, they develop habits that are like not always the most endearing to women. And same with women. When women just hang out with women, they develop habits that are not always endearing to men. We have to learn to love one another, and young people aren't learning to love one another because they're only hanging out online in places where you don't develop functional human social cues, and they develop habits that are highly sex specific. And so you get these like very gendered, like you don't need to know the gender of someone online to know their gender. If you just watch how they talk, watch the vocabulary they use, you can pretty much guess their sex.
Yeah. Okay, so one element of this is sort of economic, as you outlined, basically that um, uh, people, particularly men in their 20s, are not earning as much relative to the rest of the population as they once might have, and that means people are more likely to wait to cohabit or have children. And or get married, and that means they have later children, which means they have less time to have the number that they might want. Is there much evidence that people are having fewer children than they want? Or
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So we have survey data on fertility desires.
Mm.
We have so much data on this. This is something the demographers have been surveying for almost a century. It's like some of the oldest surveys we have are actually surveys of family preferences. And what we see is that people in Western countries today still generally desire 2 children on average. Economists are often skeptical of these answers that people give, like this kind of, maybe this is castles in the air. There's a couple of reasons I think we should take these answers seriously. One is that they're longitudinally predictive. If you ask a bunch of 16-year-olds how many kids they want to have, they're not perfectly accurate, obviously, right? People's lives change. They change their opinions. Some people overshoot. Some people undershoot. On average, a lot of people undershoot compared to only a few people overshooting. But if you compare the people who say they wanted 3 when they were teenagers to the people who say they wanted 2, the people who say they wanted 3 really do end up with more kids. And we know this because we have a lot of longitudinal surveys where we've done this exercise. And we can see that, yes, people who said they wanted 3 had more kids than people who said they wanted 2. And people who said they wanted 2 had more kids than people who said they wanted 1. And people who said they wanted 1. Like, it's a linear scale.
Yeah.
Okay? The more kids you say you want to have, the more kids you actually have when you're like 45 or whatever.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to collect this data because we have to wait like 3 decades between first survey and completed fertility. But we have enough cohorts now where we've done this, where we can say, yeah, these preferences, they are predictive of behavior, even though on average everybody undershoots.
Yeah.
Okay.
But wouldn't that apply to a lot of stated preferences? So I'm sure if you asked people how frequently would you ideally like to go to the gym or go to church or whatever, people will tend to say, I would like to go more than I actually do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're they're really being restrained. It might just be that it's socially desirable to say, oh, I would like to go to church every week or whatever.
So I would say, one, maybe this is a reason we should actually take stated preferences a little more seriously. But two, you're right. Okay, maybe these preferences are predictive but lightly held.
Mm.
Okay, so let's think about that. How would we know if preferences are lightly held? Well, one thing we could do is we could look at people who fail to achieve their goals and see how they feel about it.
Mm.
Okay, so what we can do is some of these surveys have happiness data, like life satisfaction stuff. So we can say, okay, where did people fall in the rank order of life satisfaction when they were like 20? Okay. And then where do they fall in the rank order when they're 40? And does overshooting or undershooting predict a change in rank order?
Mm.
Okay. So some people are just miserable their whole life, and some people are just happy their whole life. So we don't want to just say like the absolute happiness level. We just want to know, did their relative happiness change in a way that's related to their success or failure to have the kids they want?
Mm.
Okay. And there are a couple surveys where we can do this. It is a bit noisy, I'm going to admit, because also longitudinal surveys tend to not be huge sample size. But what we can see is that people who overshoot their preferences tend to have similar or positive changes in rank order as people who hit their preferences.
Mm.
That is, having more kids than you thought you wanted tends to make you happier.
Mm.
Now, that might sound weird. This is not me saying, yay, unintended pregnancy. What's actually going on is when people's lives go in a good way, they tend to increase their fertility preferences and have more kids. Okay.
Mm.
So you got married younger, you were wealthier than you expected, so you had more kids. But people who undershoot their fertility preferences tend to fall considerably down the rank order of happiness.
Mm.
Okay. So that's suggestive, but let's go even more causal. Okay. There's one group of people that we know wants kids, and that's people who get IVF treatments.
Mm.
Okay. But some of them succeed in having babies with IVF, and some of them fail. So how would we know if these preferences, because everybody getting IVF wants to have kids.
Yep.
Nobody's like, I didn't want to have kids, but I accidentally got IVF. These people want kids. So how would we know if getting successful, if having a kid changes happiness? Well, IVF failure is quasi-random with respect to happiness. Okay. People who have successful IVF are not on average pre-IVF, they're not more depressed or less depressed than people whose IVF fails. Okay. And you have data on this from the Nordic countries. Pre-IVF mental health does not predict IVF success or failure. After IVF, people's odds of being prescribed antidepressants, anti-anxiety, antipsychotics rises dramatically if IVF fails.
Mm.
Which is to say, if you want a baby and you have a baby, you're fine. You don't become more depressed.
Yeah.
You want a baby and you don't have a baby, your odds of being prescribed drugs to manage depression and anxiety skyrocket.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
IVF might be a unique subpopulation.
They are
However,
obviously
don't
very
know how-
committed to
What's
this. Well, in that case, they are very committed to their stated preference.
Right. But what I'm saying is, in general longitudinal data,
Mm.
we see a negative effect of undershooting, but we wonder maybe it's not strictly causal. So then if we go with a niche case where we can see causality, we find the same effect. Now, I'm not saying IVF people are strictly generalizable, but they are useful for showing a mechanism that we already see is descriptively matches the population estimates.
Mm.
Okay.
Okay.
So if we know that the statements are predictive longitudinally, if we know that in a representative sample, people who undershoot become less happy, and if we know that in a sample with good causal inference, failure to have desired children causes a large decline in mental health, then I think we can just say these preferences are real revelations of an underlying welfare function.
Okay, so if people do become happier when they have more children, for the most part, on average, wouldn't we expect as incomes rise, people to have more children? And if you at least look over the last 100 years, that has not been a very straightforward correlation at all.
Yeah.
What accounts for that?
So incomes have gone up all around the world, but that's not the only thing that's changed around the world,
Hmm.
right? Life expectancy changed, cultural values changed, all kinds of things changed. If we specify a model that tries to control for those things, say with country fixed effects and linear time trends, what we find is that fertility is procyclical. That is, during economic boom times, fertility goes up.
Hmm.
During economic busts, fertility goes down. Okay? We can also use lottery studies. Okay? Lottery studies where people's fertility is randomly shocked or people's income is randomly shocked.
Hmm.
And we can see that in lottery studies, when women win the lottery, there's basically no change in their fertility, okay? Which suggests fertility would be a slightly inferior good. When men win the lottery, their fertility goes up, and we can see this in many lottery studies.
Hmm.
There's a variety of ways to understand this gender bias. Basically, what it really is that marriage is the mediating mechanism, okay? So when women win the lottery, it doesn't change their marriage odds. When men win the lottery, it does change their marriage odds, and marriage is the causal factor mediating fertility. So, lottery studies get at a causal mechanism. We're literally randomly assigning income or wealth in these cases. And what we see is winning the lottery nudges men into marriage and causes more babies. We can also see this in like exogenous shocks to income, like due to trade liberalization or resource booms, that yes, when you shock income, positive shocks to income boost fertility, negative shocks to income reduce fertility. The cross-sectional relationship and this like over time relationship are biased by the fact that income is not the only thing that varies in these countries. The other big thing that varies is their cultural norms shaped by their media diet. When a country is exposed to Western media, their fertility falls even if their incomes don't change at all.
Hmm. Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, okay, so even if we accept that people do genuinely want to have more children than they're having and it would make them happier, from an economic perspective, why would we care that much about this? Surely it's primarily the job of the individual to make themselves happy and, okay, maybe people would be more happy if they had more holidays each year. You wouldn't necessarily sort of pursue state programs to try and encourage additional holiday taking. Um, what are the economic consequences of having sort of persistent below replacement birth rates?
Yeah, there are a number of them. The obvious ones are things like paying for pension programs or intergenerational transfers. That's not just public pensions, of course, even private investment. In the long run, the typical return on investment in a society is going to decline as you have uh, basically more old people consuming without producing and fewer young people contributing to economic production. Um, but and I think those are kind of interesting reasons. But I think the biggest economic consequence, um, well, there's two big economic consequences. One is kind of niche. If you're South Korea or you're Taiwan
Mm.
or you're Ukraine or Estonia or Finland, there's a huge economic consequence to being conquered by aggressive neighbors.
Right.
Okay. And quite frankly, ability to defend yourself scales with population.
Mm.
So for the niche case of countries that have aggressive neighbors, I think there are very compelling reasons to avoid being annexed by your enemies. Okay. Setting that aside,
Yeah.
Britain has the stopping power of water, which is a great advantage in your favor. Maybe you don't need that. You just need the Royal Navy,
Right.
which is in such great shape these days. Um, uh, okay. Um, Setting that aside, I think the better general argument is about innovation.
Mm.
Patenting is simply a function of the number of smart, educated people you have in your society, and smartness is more or less a random draw from the population distribution at the population level.
Yeah.
So if you double the size of your population via fertility,
Mm.
you're going to get twice as many super smart people.
Mm.
Um, with immigration, it's a bit more complicated. Some immigrants are a non-random draw in terms of ability to patent. Some of them are way up. Immigrants on average tend to have higher likelihood of like patenting and entrepreneurship than natives in most countries. But of course, some immigrants are much lower.
Mm.
That's a very complicated dynamic. But since we're talking about fertility, we can say that fertility is like almost by definition going to produce a population that has a very similar odds of patenting as your existing population, very similar odds of innovation. And the key thing is that innovation is a non-rival risk. It's a public good. Okay.
Yeah.
So if I invent a new thing, there are some private benefits to me governed by like the patent system and my ability to capitalize and stuff like that. But most of the goods flow to wider society.
Mm.
Productivity rises for everyone. We're all better off. A single genius makes the entire world richer,
Mm.
right? Ergo, the absolute number of, and I should say it's not actually just population, it's population times education times access to capital markets. Okay. So a really smart person born in a country where they can't get educated and they can't access capital is no good to humanity,
Yeah.
right? It's a wasted potential. But in a country like Britain, you have very good access to capital markets. You have perfectly good education.
Mm.
So we need you people cranking.
Right.
Okay. Like a baby born in Burkina Faso tragically does not contribute a ton to global human potential because they are unlikely to get good education. Even if they do, they are unlikely to get good access to capital markets.
Mm.
Also, there's other issues like they might have been exposed to malnutrition when they were young, and so
Yeah.
they might literally not cognitively develop appropriately because of,
Yeah.
parasitic diseases in childhood or whatever. But in countries like the US or Britain or France or Norway or whatever, or Japan or Korea, it's not a Europe thing, okay?
Yeah.
We're not talking about like white countries, okay? Or like Qatar, okay?
Yeah.
Qatar, like there's plenty of countries where people can get educated, they can access capital. It is so good for humanity to make a lot of babies in those
Right.
countries.
Well, couldn't you, I mean, one of the arguments is you could equally resolve this by just relying on immigration. So you have a birth rate that is a bit below replacement, but you sort of allow more sort of smart, reasonably well-educated people into your country, and then that will also help to resolve the issue with the dependency ratio, which can create problems with pension schemes.
Yeah.
In your view, is that not a sustainable solution, or?
There are a couple reasons why. So to be clear, if you've got a society that's a bit below replacement,
Hmm.
supplementing with immigration is a great plan.
Yeah.
Okay. We're not a bit below replacement.
Yeah.
Okay. Britain is like what, 1.4 or something?
I think 1.5 was
1.5.
yeah.
Okay. So you're only losing a quarter of your population size in each generation.
Right.
A quarter.
Yeah.
That's not a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. This is, a chasm between replacement and where you are. Losing 25% of your population each generation that's not a little thing you fix with a few immigrants here or there. Okay. So then what is the problem with supplementing with immigration on that scale? There's a couple reasons. One, there just are political constraints.
Yeah.
Okay. It's point blank. We all know this. We all see this. You have to decide if those are really the politics you want. Okay.
Yeah.
You want far-right parties to be 20 to 40% of the electorate. Do you want that? If your answer is yes, great. Bring immigrants. Maybe you'll keep maintaining, liberal democracy with 51% of the vote.
Yeah.
But that seems like a really high-risk strategy
Mm.
because like you're really rolling the dice there. Okay. The second reason is innovation, I said, is non-rivalrous. That's actually not strictly true. Okay. The country that innovates does get a first mover advantage.
Mm.
And the extent of that first mover advantage does depend on who the innovator is.
Mm.
Let me give an example of this. AI is a path-breaking technology,
Mm.
okay? People think it's going to change the world. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, who knows? It matters the flag on the passport of the person who patents, even if they all do it in America.
Mm.
Why? Because the flag on that passport influences the pace at which ideas spread to other countries.
Mm.
Okay? So a Chinese passport holder working for a US company who innovates, information about that innovation will spread much more rapidly to China than if the flag on the passport was Australian or
Right.
American or Paraguayan or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay? It is quite literally a security question
Mm.
for countries. It is a geostrategic question on who does the innovation. And native-born innovators are, like, quite frankly, yes, on a strategic level, it matters that the people doing the cutting-edge innovation for your country are loyal to your country.
Yeah.
So it matters that they are native-born citizens of your country.
Mm.
Native-born citizens are your most, and again, this is not an ethnic thing. You know, a third-generation Pakistani Brit is a perfectly trustworthy
Yeah.
citizen of the UK. Um, uh, so, but my point is, like, yes, like, it actually does matter that the innovation in your country is not all being done by people who, as soon as they hit a certain threshold, move to their home country and cause it and allow it to scale up faster, limiting the benefits to the country that had the ecosystem that generated the innovation. That actually does matter.
Right.
Another reason why immigration is not a perfect substitute is the question of desired fertility. And we don't think of this as economic, but I really think this is important. Governments do care about the happiness of their people.
Mm.
Okay, they do. Um, in the US, we think of the intrinsic trifecta of fundamental liberties as being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now we say the pursuit, not the obtaining, but a society where, like, it's one thing to say, oh, I want $1 million yacht.
Yeah.
Okay. The government is not obligated to give you that.
Mm.
But, like, I want to have 2 kids. That's not a crazy desire. And if we cannot allow people who desire to continue human civilization, if we can't supply an ecosystem where they're able to do so on a regular basis, that is the government's problem. That is a failure to provide suitable opportunities to enable the pursuit of happiness.
Oh,
Um, yeah.
okay. So many governments around the world have made some attempts to increase fertility rates. You know, you've got Hungary has made a big song and dance about the 5% of GDP that they're putting towards
A
family
number you will
policies.
never be able to verify from public statistics.
Ah, right. Well, this is, I suppose, an interesting question on this is, um, do, say, fiscal transfers of this kind, say just giving people a lump of money for each child they have, um, does that seem to have a noticeable effect on the number of children people have, and how much of an effect?
Yes, it does. We have decades of economic research that shows clearly and decisively, unambiguously, that when you pay for babies, you get more babies. Furthermore, the relationship is relatively stable across dozens of studies in dozens of contexts. That is, a cash transfer, and I am focused on cash transfers here, so not daycare,
Yep.
okay? Not maternity leave, cash.
Mm.
So, like, a baby bonus or a child allowance or the shifts in the degree of wage replacement from maternity leave. So not
Yeah.
changes in length, but wage replacement. Or like a home care allowance or something. For every percentage point you increase cash transfers for fertility, percentage as a share of GDP per capita,
Mm-hmm.
we'll get about a quarter of a percentage point increase in fertility. Okay, so here's what I mean. Let's say, like in the US, let's say you increase the child tax credit by $1,000 per baby.
Yeah.
So everybody gets $1,000 per year from age 0 to 17 for each baby that they have. The present discounted value of that is about $13,000,
Hmm.
which comes to about 15% of US GDP per capita.
Hmm.
Okay? 15% divided by 4 is what, like 4%, 3 or 4%,
Yeah.
which means we would expect that program to increase the US birth rate counterfactually versus some plausible counterfactual. So
Okay.
maybe versus like the average of Canada and Australia, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. Some plausible counterfactual by about 3 or 4%. Okay?
Right.
This ratio is observed around the world in just a gajillion studies. And we can also verify this. Actually, I have a paper coming out in the next couple weeks where I show all the math on this.
Yeah.
This is true. This is the ratio. This is how it works. Um, uh, so yeah, we can increase fertility with money. Now, it is a bit expensive.
Yeah. I mean, 3 or 4% as a return on $13,000 doesn't sound like a huge sort of amount. In order,
you have to think
if
about it
it,
a couple different ways.
yeah, like in
One,
order to get an additional child, say on average, you're what talking about kind of $200,000, something like that. Just trying to do mental maths here.
so what you have to think about is, so you end up the price tag in the US, for example, and again, the price tag is cheaper in Britain because your GDP per capita is lower.
Yeah, we are
And
desperately poor.
um,
Uh,
um, but so like in the US, for example, this pencils out to something like 200 to 400,000 in total spending per marginal child.
hmm,
So you have to ask, what's the present value of adding a person to American society?
okay.
Uh, The conventional statistical value of a human life in the US is anywhere from $3 to $20 million. Lifetime taxes paid by the average person are anywhere from estimates range from $150 to $400,000. So it sounds like the government would be basically break even in terms of taxes.
Hmm.
Um, on the margin. Although, of course, some of those taxes are already paying for services we already provide to that person, so it's not strictly break even. But in terms of total present value, this is massively winning, right? Like the total present value of adding a life is so much higher than what it costs to add a life. And I think that's because most of the benefits of adding a human are externalities,
Hmm.
right? They're all the other people we benefit through it. Now, there are also internalities. A lot of the benefits, a lot of the statistical value of a human life are the benefit to the person themselves. So you could make an argument, if you were an economically minded psychopath, that babies born from this program should just be born with debt.
Right.
Okay? Now, I don't think this is a bad idea. The
So
way to actually
everyone has a
say, look,
$400,000 debt
it'd be
when they're born.
worthwhile to increase some taxes,
Hmm.
pay for baby benefits. Okay. What taxes? Well, I would say consumption taxes are a nice one to increase.
Hmm.
But I would say in general, like, I think it's perfectly reasonable to increase taxes on childless people to pay for it. Childless people are less economically needy to begin with.
Hmm.
They don't have dependents. We could say non-disabled childless people. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
So if you're a childless person and you're, not disabled, and you're, let's say, over the age of 25 and under the age of 65, yeah, I think you should pay higher taxes because you are a dependent on society. Your future, your retirement savings, your pensions, everything, it depends on the labor of future people, and those future people depend on the labor of parents.
Hmm.
And you know what? You should pay extra for the fact that you're not contributing to society by raising children who are going to pay for the future. So I think raising taxes on childless people
Yeah.
to pay for a baby benefit is totally reasonable.
Yeah. Couldn't they say, well, already a lot of their taxes are going on benefits and services that are consumed by children? So public education, for example, there are big benefits that go to children that are
Yep.
already factored in and they're not directly benefiting from.
And who paid for their public education? Not them. All their taxes to pay for public education, practically speaking, are paying their education debt.
Mm.
Okay? You got publicly educated. Now you pay the public back with your taxes that pay for the next generation of public education. Okay? So, and of course, public education money, that's not compensating families for having kids, right? The benefits of public education, they also flow to you
Mm.
because you benefit from having the next generation be educated and be able to work and have a job. Okay. So parents, it's not like you're paying, like, it's important to understand public education spending is not paying parents. Okay. Like, it's not like if a parent says, oh, if I'm not going to put my kid in public education, I'll just take that money.
Mm.
That's not how that works. Okay. Like, the money is only for education. You are training the child to be a productive citizen. You're not paying the parent for the work of raising a child. And I'm saying we should pay the parent for the work of raising a child. And I think the people who should pay for that should not be entirely, but should be disproportionately people who are opting out.
Mm. Okay. You've written a bit actually, with, for example, with Clara Piano about other non-fiscal measures that countries can pursue to allow people to have, more of the children they want, but which don't cost, $200,000 to $400,000 per child. I'm thinking particularly about your 2024 paper on economic freedom in the US and fertility gaps. Could you talk a bit about what's the relationship here and what do you think may be causing it?
Yeah. So I have two papers, one with, actually, I think Clara might be a co-author on both of them, but one is the paper with Clara, and then another one is with another team, where we specifically look at childcare regulations. So
Is this with Vincent Geloso?
yeah, and Anna Claire Flowers, I think
Yeah.
that's the first author on it. So the first one was on economic freedom. So economic freedom is this variable we have for U.S. states that is basically a vector of estimates of like the burdensomeness of regulations on contracting, labor flexibility, business formation, tax rates, all these different things.
Hmm.
And we found, and then we also have data. I've been collecting data for a couple years. We have this huge survey sample. It's like 20,000 women at this point. Where we can say for a given state, here's how many children women in this state want to have. Now, this matters because a classic problem in the economic literature is we say, well, such and such a policy increased fertility. But then you have to say, well, was the policy endogenous? Maybe the reason the policy was implemented is because this is a society that already wanted children. Right?
Yeah.
So we control for that by saying we're not going to measure the effect on fertility. We're going to measure the effect on the gap between fertility and women's desired fertility. Okay?
Yeah.
So we're looking at the gap.
Yeah.
We want to close that gap because we think that that gap is a valid policy goal. It's certainly more valid than the government just saying, regardless of if you want it, you're going to have 2.2 kids. Right? Like the government should not be telling people to have kids they don't want to have.
Yeah.
And what we found is greater economic freedom is quite strongly associated with a smaller fertility gap. And what's also interesting is when we use the fertility gap measure, we can eliminate the effects of things like religion, migrant background, all these things on fertility. They all just operate through the fertility preference vector. Okay. So we can eliminate all these things. Are like, well, did you control for all those things? They end up just operating through the fertility preference channel, which is like awesome, actually. What we show is economic freedom, very good. Specifically, we show that most of this is operating through the sub-index on labor freedom.
Right.
Okay. So basically freedom of contracting. So a lot of this is, you can think of things like right to work. So basically, when it's really hard for companies to hire and fire according to their needs, when workers cannot easily find kind of gig work, flexible work,
Yeah.
when they don't have options in those regards, fertility is lower.
Mm.
We found that it's not super closely related to like the tax and spend element. We also showed that it's not other kinds of freedom. Like, it's not like press freedom or
Yeah.
something like that. It truly is like labor market flexibility, like
Yeah.
matters a lot.
Yeah.
And I should say, we're part of actually a long strand of literature that uses other methods to show that labor market flexibility matters a lot. By the way, what countries in Europe have the highest fertility? The Nordic countries that somewhat famously have big social welfare states, but also flexible labor markets.
Yeah.
What countries have the lowest fertility? The Southern European countries that somewhat famously have incredibly rigid labor markets.
Although isn't France an exception to this in that France has had
Because they spend a crap ton of money.
Right.
France is the paradigmatic case of just throw money at it.
Right.
And it works.
Yeah, it's just very expensive, and you can
You
use
have to
it
think
in.
about this. France's pronatal policies over the last 80 years. I published a paper where I did all the modeling to show this. France's pronatal policies have added somewhere between 5 and 10 million people to the French population. And this is overwhelmingly driven by higher fertility among people who today had 4 French grandparents. Okay? So this is not just like, oh, immigrants came in and all had a ton of babies. No. This is like people whose haplogroups are like R1A and they've been here for 10,000 years.
Yeah.
Those people had more babies
Mm.
because of French pronatal policy. France has added 5 to 10 million people because of these policies.
Yeah.
That's basically like saying without pronatal policy, France would not have the Paris metro area.
Mm.
So when we say the effects of pronatalism are small, like, oh, it would only increase fertility by 8%. If you compound 8% across 3 or 4 generations, you're talking about a very large number of people.
Yeah.
In the US, you're talking about adding entire states to our population.
Yeah.
In Britain, you're talking about like adding another Wales.
Yeah.
Now, depending on your opinion of Wales, that might be a pro or con. But regardless,
Yeah.
like these, they sound small because like, oh, it's a couple of percentage points.
Yeah.
Fertility is compound interest.
Yeah.
Okay? A compound interest rate of 2% versus 2.5% is very different.
Yeah. And what are the sort of effects of economic freedom, or say, actually, as you've mentioned it, childcare regulation, compared to sort of massive fiscal transfers?
Yeah, so the effect sizes that we find on improved economic freedom, or we also have this paper where we look specifically at childcare regulations. So like rules about how many kids per worker, rules about education of workers, all these things. Like one standard deviation change in these is associated with, off the top of my head, I want to say it's something like 7 to 15%
Wow.
increase in fertility. So pretty similar to a large fiscal package.
Right.
So if you're now, what I will say is this,
And obviously, it also, has economic benefits beyond that are,
and also
unresumed.
mention like big fiscal programs on this front also have economic benefits. So like, for example, in the US, the child tax credit is a work incentive, right? You only get it if you have tax liabilities.
Right.
So it actually increases the returns to work as well, and it increases parental labor force participation.
Yeah.
So like,
So
that's good. Now there are other child benefits sometimes that phase out with income and discourage work.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you have those in Britain.
it does matter. And
yeah.
I wouldn't say that you should design family policy without regard for those other effects.
Yeah.
But yeah, so these regulatory policies, yes, they're similar in effect to like a large fiscal benefit.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a pretty strong argument for why regulatory interventions should be a huge part of any kind of pronatal intervention. I mean, look, I'm all in favor of giving cash to families, but ignoring the regulatory side is so stupid.
Yeah.
Like, it's free money.
Well, yeah. And actually, on that topic, another obvious area of regulation that gets brought up a lot is land use regulation and restrictions on housing. What role do sort of restrictions on house building have on
They have a
fertility?
huge role.
Yeah.
They have a huge role. So at IFS, we just published a huge study. We surveyed 8,000 reproductive age, actually almost 9,000 reproductive age Americans. And we looked at their housing preferences, the kind of housing they want, all these things, to explore this question. What we found is, land use regulations have a massive impact on fertility, on family formation. The most regulated fertility, when areas become less regulated, particularly less regulated in terms of getting rid of urban growth boundaries and allowing more suburban development.
Yeah.
This does not necessarily appear to be true with building up, so like high rises.
Yeah.
But allowing more building out or allowing more building in, so like infill construction, seems to be associated with more people moving out of their parents' house, higher rates of marriage, and higher birth rates. Excessive housing costs are absolutely crippling to families. So this is a super important area of regulation that if we don't tackle it, again, I'm all in favor of throwing money at the problem, but like I would rather the money that I throw at the problem go to pay for diapers rather than rent.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. I just want to bring up the point you made about skepticism about building up in terms of apartments and flats. Is this just an effect that so obviously if you're living in a 1-bedroom flat, you're less likely to want to have children than if you're living in a sort of single family house with a garden. But may it not still be useful to build up from the perspective of fertility, in the sense that, so what you get a lot of in, say, Britain, particularly in high demand areas like London, is a lot of houses that were initially built as suburban family houses get divided up into flats or into homes of, house shares, which presumably have even worse sort of effects for people wanting to have children. If you're living with like 5 random people.
Yeah, the presence of roommates is quite negative for fertility as well.
Yeah, you can imagine.
Yeah. So the effects of apartment living are a very active area of debate among people who study this stuff. I am not a diehard on either side. There are people on both sides who really believe with an almost religious faith that building apartments must cause positive trickle down and it must help families. And then there's other people who believe with an equally religious faith, building apartments must be terrible for families. My view of the evidence is this: building stuff other than apartments definitely helps families. It unambiguously increases fertility, marriage, independent living, all this stuff. It is not incompatible with dense land use, okay? Like via infill, you can add a lot of density into single family neighborhoods without making giant apartments. If you already have 12 stories, there's probably no harm in adding 12 more. I think the balance of the evidence suggests that right now it would be disadvantageous to bulldoze a single family neighborhood and build towers, even if you were adding more square footage or square meters of housing on net.
Right.
Okay? So even if you're adding more floor space, more units, more bedrooms, bulldozing the single family to build the tower is on net possibly slightly negative for fertility. But
but what if you're simultaneously expanding the supply of
if you are expanding the supply of single family even more, then on net your reform is probably positive. But my point would be, probably all of the positivity is coming from the single family side, most likely.
Right.
Now, again, I'm just gonna flag again, the research on this is very contested. It's not settled. There's still a lot we're learning about these kind of upzoning type reforms. As a congenital market liberal myself, free market guy myself, what I want to say is just like select the whole zoning code, press delete. That's the best housing policy. But it's not clear to me that that's actually the case. And part of the reason is the construction market is wonky. So I worked with a lot of builders and architects actually, for some current projects, and it's not a super frictionless market. So I don't know exactly how it works in the UK, but in the US, it's not just regulations. Every project has to be financed, like a big development project. And banks are ultimately on the hook for this stuff. So they're not going to finance a project that they don't think is going to sell. And how do they know something's going to sell? Because the identical tower was built somewhere else and it's sold there, which means there's actually it's a very short list of projects that banks will actually finance. There's a lot of housing to build in the US that's legal to build, but that no bank will lend to build. And it's not because somebody built it and it failed.
Yeah.
Because they're just risk averse, especially with how high interest rates are right now. And so like you have a sticky market where a relatively small number of actors determine housing. And also I can say, you'd think that these banks and these companies, you'd think they're doing a lot of survey work to figure out what kind of houses people want. I can say with certainty, no, they're not. They're doing zero market research. None. Okay. There is, in the United States, there is essentially zero market research being done actually in a rigorous way, exploring the kind of housing people want. There's market research where they say, oh, this area has a bunch of double income, no kids, or this area has these types of people. But there's almost nobody actually out there doing detailed, high quality work, exploring preferences for house type. How I know that is a long story, but there really isn't anybody doing it. And so a lot of these, so the market is quite literally flying blind. And I think that there's free lunches laying around for builders that are willing to be like, I'm just going to build a neighborhood that's like dense single family. And you can see a couple places have done this and they're crazy lucrative. Like the builders that actually do this, they are clearly making a ton of money.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to find the place where it's legal, financeable, all this stuff.
Yeah. Okay. We're sort of running up to our limit. I just want to briefly touch, you've done some work as well on the effect of booster seats and booster seat requirements. What effect do child seat regulations have on the number of children people have?
So this is not my original work. It's some other researchers, but there is a paper that suggests that stricter car seat rules, so requiring car seats for older and older kids, reduce fertility, primarily because they cause families to be stuck at certain numbers of children until a kid ages out of a car seat or until they get a bigger car.
Yeah.
And look, okay, the net effect of this across like even a country the size of the US is not huge. Like statistically speaking, we're talking like a tiny fraction of 1% of like it's like 0.03% of births prevented by this or something. But it's nice because it's exemplary of how these little things add up. Okay, you can think of it as car seat regulations. But think about something. There was a big hubbub recently. There was an article that came out about the habit that some parents have where they will put a baby monitor on their kids. Like, let's say you're on vacation, you're in a hotel.
Yeah.
You put a baby monitor on your kids to watch your kids, and then you go to the restaurant downstairs to have a nice dinner with your spouse at the hotel.
Yeah.
Okay? You can watch your baby the whole time.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think this is child abuse. You shouldn't leave your kid alone. They might get kidnapped. The house, the hotel might burn down.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, if the hotel caught on fire, I'd run upstairs and get my kid. But the point is, we have a shift of like regulatory norms, social norms, all this stuff that makes every step of parenting a little bit more expensive.
Mm.
Okay? You can't just give your kid, canned fruit anymore.
Yeah.
You have to give them fresh blackberries that are 4 times as expensive.
Right.
You can't just put a monitor on your kid and go downstairs and have a drink with your spouse. You have to sit there quietly in the dark
Yeah.
at 7 p.m. the entire night until your kid goes to sleep.
Mm.
You can't just
Yeah.
put your 5-year-old in a seat. You have to have a specially made car seat. And by the way, the car seat is $200 and it expires after 3 years.
Yeah.
How
And
does plastic expire? There's
Yeah.
all these things. And we just nickel and dime parents. We bill them higher money, we bill them higher time, we bill them higher stress, and it just makes parenting
Yeah.
worse.
And also, it sort of extends into regulatory requirements, because one of the really interesting shifts in Britain in the last 20 years, I don't know if you've come across this, is the dramatic decline in the number of childminders. Like people who you just pay to, watch your kid for an
And
afternoon.
you won't regulate that, right?
Yeah. So previously it was
See,
just
we don't regulate that in the US. You
No.
hire a babysitter.
no. In Britain, if you want to be a childminder, you have to jump through all sorts of hoops. You have to sort of prepare an education plan for your 4-year-old who you're
See, I
watching.
literally just ask one of the secondary schoolers at my church,
Yeah.
like, "Hey, will you come over and watch my kid for a couple hours? My wife and I are gonna go on a date."
Yeah. Okay, that would be okay because you're not paying them for
Oh,
it.
no, I'm paying them.
Oh, okay, then they would have to register with Ofsted, the
Insane.
regulatory agency.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. And so the predictable results are that the number of people doing this has fallen off a cliff, because they're often people who just want to do it for a short period of time, aren't particularly interested in a load of bureaucracy, but it's an extra
That's a piece of
requirement.
regulation you should just highlight and hit delete on.
Yeah.
Get rid of the whole thing. There's no reason to have any regulation at all on privately contracted individuals who come to watch your children in your house. This is something the market can absolutely regulate on its own. And so you get things like in the US, we have like care.com, right? Which is like, now I don't use this, but a lot of people do. It's like, basically it's like Airbnb or Uber, but for babysitters.
Yeah.
And the point is they all have public reviews, all this
Yeah.
stuff. And like, they don't need a certification. They have public reviews.
Yeah.
Like,
And
public
parents obviously have a pretty big incentive on their own. There's no market failure. You don't want some like complete idiot looking after your children.
leave reviews.
Yeah.
Okay. Like,
Yeah.
so like this is something, babysitting is something that is relatively low cost, that people consume repeatedly
Mm.
and about which they have strong opinions.
Yeah.
And as such, this is something where the market can easily self-regulate. It's not something like things that are like a huge cost that you only buy one time.
Mm.
That kind of thing, markets struggle to regulate.
Yeah.
But markets can self-regulate babysitting.
Yeah.
Especially because like literally anyone can babysit.
Mm.
Like humans are evolved to do this.
Yeah.
This is not hard.
Okay. So, as a sort of final question, do you have any articles, books, blogs that you would recommend to viewers who have been interested in this discussion and would like to know more about, evidence-based policy when it comes to fertility?
Yeah, for articles, I mean, really, you can get on Institute for Family Studies Pronatalism Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
That's the research project I had up. Our landing page isn't always the most updated. Really just the IFS blog generally, but the Pronatalism Initiatives page, we try to house some of our more recent research. And I mean, not to toot our own horn, but we're doing good work. The reports that we write are fiendishly long and
Hmm.
full of graphs and tables. And so, if you're a family policy nerd, we've got you covered.
Right. Well, great. Yeah. Well, I think it's a really, really interesting topic with a lot of economic relevance, and probably shouldn't be left to authoritarian weirdos. So thank you for
Yes.
coming on.
Fact check,
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. If and for viewers, if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to see more interviews and content, do subscribe to the IEA's YouTube channel, and also subscribe to our Substack at iea.insider.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.